Imagine waking up one morning to a world that no longer recognizes itself. It is February 28th, 2026. Dawn has barely broken over Tehran. In the quiet compound where power has lived unchallenged for 37 years, an 86-year-old man sits with his closest aides. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, the shadow of God on earth, the man who shaped Iran's destiny since 1989, looks up from papers, perhaps sensing something in the air. He has survived wars, sanctions, uprisings, assassinations of his generals. He has buried dreams of reform under layers of fear and steel. Then the sky opens. A precision strike, joint American and Israeli, cuts through every defense. Bunker busters tear into reinforced concrete. In seconds, the heart of the regime is pierced. Khamenei is gone. His daughter, son-in-law, grandson, gone. The chief of staff, top commanders of the Revolutionary Guards, gone. The chain of command that held Iran in iron grip for decades is severed in a single, surgical moment. This is not just the death of a man. This is the death of an era. For 47 years, the Islamic Republic has stood as a fortress of defiance. Born in the fire of 1979, it promised justice, piety, resistance. It delivered repression, isolation, and rivers of blood. Mahsa Amini's death in 2022 lit the fuse. January 2026's protests turned it into an inferno. Thousands massacred, cities blacked out, youth screaming, "Woman, life, freedom," even as bullets answered. The regime survived, barely. But survival is not immortality. Donald Trump, back in the White House, had spoken plainly weeks earlier. Regime change would be the best thing that could happen. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's iron-willed leader, had waited decades for this window. Proxies weakened, Hezbollah shattered, Hamas broken, Houthis quieted, nuclear sites crippled, and inside Iran, a people exhausted, angry, hopeful. When the missiles fell on February 28th, the world held its breath. Now, March 1st, 2026, smoke still rises over Tehran. Israel strikes again into the very heart of the city. Iran fires back, missiles toward Jerusalem, U.S. bases, Gulf allies. 40 days of mourning are declared, but in the streets, people dance. Fireworks burst over Azadi Square. In Isfahan, Karaj, small towns, crowds celebrate, not grieve. The regime calls for unity, the people call for freedom. Succession begins in chaos. The Assembly of Experts scrambles. The IRGC fractures. Protests swell again. 40-day mourning ceremonies become rallies. Universities go online to stop gatherings, but the fire spreads anyway. This is the moment everything changes, or breaks. What happens when the unbreakable falls? When a theocracy built on fear loses its face? When a nation of 90 million, half under 30, finally sees a crack wide enough to push through? We stand at the edge of history. Some see liberation, others see abyss. A wider war, civil strife, a new Iran rising from ashes, or another tyrant in clerical robes? No one knows yet. But one thing is certain, the shadow that loomed over Iran for half a century is gone, and the light, whatever it brings, is coming. This is the story of Iran's breaking point, of defiance that finally met its match, of a people who refused to stay silent. Stay with us, because what comes next may change the Middle East forever. It began with fire and faith. In the spring of 1979, the streets of Tehran boiled over. The Shah's palace emptied, his jets fled the country, and a bearded cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile to claim a nation. The Islamic Revolution wasn't just a change of rulers, it was a rebirth. Iran declared itself a theocracy, a fortress of Shia Islam standing against the West's arrogance. Neither East nor West, they chanted, only Islamic Republic. America became the Great Satan, Israel the Zionist enemy. For the next 4 decades, that defiance shaped everything. When Khomeini died, the mantle fell to Ali Khamenei, quiet, calculating, a former president turned supreme leader. For 37 years, he ruled not as a king, but as the shadow of God on earth, Velayat e Faqih, guardianship of the jurist. He controlled the military, the judiciary, the guardians of the revolution. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps became his sword and shield. Under him, Iran built alliances across the region, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, a crescent of influence they called it. Enemies called it terror. But the real battle was never only abroad. Inside Iran, the people grew restless, the economy strangled by sanctions, inflation devouring savings. Youth, more than half the population under 30, saw no future in a system that demanded obedience above all. The spark in 2022 was Mahsa Amini, a young woman who died in custody after morality police arrested her for improper hijab. Her death ignited the largest uprising since the revolution itself. Cities burned, security forces answered with bullets, thousands arrested, hundreds killed. The regime survived, but the wound never healed. By late 2025, the cracks widened. Protests flared again, fueled by economic collapse and whispers of hope from abroad. In Washington, Donald Trump had returned to the White House. He had never forgiven Iran for humiliating America in 1979, for the hostage crisis, for sponsoring attacks on U.S. forces. His first term had seen the killing of General Qasem Soleimani. Now, re-elected, he promised maximum pressure once more, but this time he spoke openly of regime change. The nuclear program was the red line. Iran insisted it was peaceful. The West and Israel saw otherwise. Enrichment levels climbed toward weapons grade. Centrifuges spun in underground halls at Natanz and Fordo. In June 2025, Israel and the U.S. struck hard, bombing key facilities, setting the program back years. Iran rebuilt, quietly, defiantly. Talks in Geneva dragged on through February 2026, Omani mediators shuttling proposals, but demands clashed. America wanted zero enrichment and dismantled sites. Iran wanted sanctions lifted first. No deal emerged. Meanwhile, the streets stirred again. Student demonstrations swelled in Tehran, Isfahan, Tabriz. The regime cracked down brutally, reports of mass arrests, internet blackouts, Basij militias firing into crowds. Trump watched from afar and sent a message that echoed around the world. Help is on the way. He called for Iranians to rise, promised support if they did. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, long Iran's most determined foe, coordinated in the shadows. Intelligence flowed, plans formed. Khomeini, now in his mid-80s, knew the storm was gathering. Health rumors swirled. He appeared frailer in public appearances. Yet he refused compromise. Death to America remained the official chant. The Revolutionary Guards prepared for war. Proxies across the region stood ready. But inside the regime, fear crept in. Who would succeed him? The Assembly of Experts had lists, but no one truly knew. As February 2026 drew to a close, the air grew thick with inevitability. Negotiations stalled, protests refused to die, and in darkened rooms in Washington and Jerusalem, decisions were made. What happened next would shake the foundations of the Islamic Republic.
No sirens, no air raid warnings, no final broadcast from the state. At precisely 0452 local time, the lead Israeli F-35I Adir stealth skin swallowing radar releases its deadly cargo high over northern Tehran. 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, each weighing 30,000 pounds, drop in perfect silence. They plummet for 12 long seconds, accelerating through the cold night air. Their target? The fortified Nayavaran complex, once a royal palace, now the regime's most guarded sanctuary. thick layers of reinforced concrete, anti-air batteries, electronic jamming fields, designed to withstand anything short of Armageddon. Today, they meet their match. The first impact is deep, almost quiet, then the earth convulses. A contained fireball erupts upward, professional and precise. Secondary blasts ripple out, stored fuel, backup generators, perhaps ammunition caches. 90 seconds later, 3 more strikes land in tight sequence. One tears into the IRGC's Lavazan Hill command bunker. Another obliterates the Supreme Leader's private quarters. The third punches straight through the reinforced meeting hall. Intelligence was flawless. CIA assets fed through Mossad channels just 48 hours earlier had confirmed the location. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, 86 years old, frail but unyielding, was there, surrounded by the core of power. His son, Mojtaba, whispered heir, daughter Bushra and her husband, IRGC chief Hossein Salami, intelligence head Mohammad Kazemi, armed forces chief Mohammad Bagheri, the most senior clerical voices on the Supreme Council. They had gathered for an emergency war council as protests raged and foreign threats loomed. In one coordinated breath, they ceased to exist. The assault spreads like lightning. At 0455, American MQ-9 Reaper drones launched from Gulf carriers send Hellfire missiles screaming into 2 major IRGC missile storage sites south of the capital. At 0458, Israeli F-15I squadrons released JDAMs onto the Parchin military complex, long suspected of nuclear warhead design work, already scarred from 2025 raids but still operational. At 0503, a follow-on wave collapses the main access tunnels at Fordo, the mountain-buried enrichment fortress, sealing command centers without fully destroying the centrifuges below. This is no indiscriminate raid. No residential blocks, no civilian infrastructure, no mosques, hospitals, schools. Every target is military, leadership, or nuclear-related. The message rings clear across the region. This is surgical decapitation of the Islamic Republic's head and nervous system. Iran's defenses finally awaken at 0515. S-300 batteries, homegrown Bavar 373 systems, radar arrays light up in panic. Missiles streak skyward, most chasing ghosts. The stealth jets are already gone, vanishing over the Caspian or slipping back through Iraqi airspace. In retaliation, Iran unleashes its own barrage. Shahab and Fateh ballistic missiles arc toward Israel. Arrow 3 and David's Sling interceptors claim most, a few detonate harmlessly in fields near Haifa and Beersheba. Casualties remain low on both sides, for now. Tehran stirs to chaos. State television blacks out within the hour. When the signal returns, a pale, trembling anchor reads from a single sheet. The criminal Zionist regime and American imperialism have martyred our supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and senior commanders in a treacherous attack. The nation is called to unity, calm, and steadfastness in the face of the enemy. Calm is already shattered. By 0600, tiny crowds form in Azadi Square, not to mourn, but to process the impossible. A university student, scarf discarded, climbs atop a concrete barrier. "She's gone," she screams into the dawn. "They're all gone!" Cheers explode. Contraband fireworks, meant for Nowruz, light the sky in bursts of red and gold. In Isfahan, Shiraz, Tabriz, Mashhad, similar scenes unfold. Students flood avenues chanting old slogans turned against their makers. Death to the dictator. For the first time in memory, no immediate gunfire answers. The regime's contingency machinery grinds into motion. At 0730, Vice President Mohammad Mokber appears on air, face drawn, voice unsteady. He invokes Article 111. He is now acting supreme leader, pending Assembly of Experts confirmation. 40 days of official mourning are declared. Crushing revenge is promised. Nationwide internet is severed. Bajit units are mobilized. Arrest lists from January are revived. But the command structure is fractured beyond repair. IRGC brigade commanders receive conflicting orders or none at all. Some units remain in place, others reposition toward the capital, not to protect the state, but to guard their own survival. Encrypted chats and smuggled Starlink connections spread the names like wildfire. Mojtaba dead, Salami dead, Bagheri dead, the clerical inner circle erased. No undisputed successor waits in the wings. By midday, the streets belong to the people again. Demonstrations erupt in over 30 cities, not choreographed like January, but wild, spontaneous, dangerous. Khomeini posters are torn down and burned. Small-town statues of Khomeini are pulled from pedestals. In some districts, IRGC checkpoints stand empty as conscripts slip away in civilian clothes. Israeli launches a second wave at 1400, missile silos, drone hangars, remaining command nodes. Iran fires back. Fateh 110 rockets hammer U.S. bases in Iraq and eastern Syria. 11 American service members die at al-Assad. 23 Israeli civilians perish in the north when a missile slips through the net. That evening, President Trump addresses the nation from the White House. "We have brought justice to a regime that has oppressed its own people for generations. America stands ready to support Iranians who choose freedom if that is their will." Netanyahu follows. "The head of the snake is severed, the body writhes. We will finish what must be finished." As February 28th ends, Tehran lies under a pall of smoke. Electricity flickers, cell networks crawl, families comb overflowing hospitals. In alleyways and rooftops, millions ask the same question in hushed voices: what happens now? The supreme leader is dead. The regime is hemorrhaging. After 47 years of iron rule, the people of Iran are, finally, breathing free air.
The morning after is never clean. When sunlight finally touched the streets of Tehran on March 1st, it found a capital that had forgotten who held the reins. Acting Supreme Leader Mohammad Mokbar appeared on state television for the third time in 24 hours. Same charcoal suit, same tie, now crooked. Eyes rimmed red behind heavy frames. He clutched a single sheet of paper as though it might anchor him. 40 days of national mourning, he declared. All public gatherings forbidden except regime-approved ceremonies. The armed forces on maximum alert. Foreign agents and domestic rioters would face justice without mercy. Unity, he said, 3 times, voice cracking on the last. Unity is our only shield. The green and red backdrop behind him looked faded, almost apologetic. Outside that studio, unity was already a memory. By 9:15 a.m., Azadi Square held at least 30,000 people, far more than the day before. University students linked arms in long chains, passing bottles of water and flatbread handed out by neighborhood bakeries that had opened their doors for free. Women stood at the very front, heads bare, holding up faded photographs. Mahsa Amini smiling in a family snapshot, Nika Shakarami laughing at a birthday party, Serena Esmailazadeh mid-dance in a grainy video still. The faces of 2022 never erased. Chants shifted with every hour. Khamenei is gone became Mokbar, you're next, then simplified to one word repeated like a drum: freedom, freedom. No one waved the official flag. Instead, white sheets appeared, some painted with red handprints, others bearing the old lion and sun emblem in hasty marker. A few elderly men carried portraits of Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister overthrown in 1953, as though reminding everyone there had once been another Iran. The Basij militiamen stationed around the square did not open fire that morning. They stood. They watched. Some looked away. The pattern repeated across the country with eerie synchronicity. Shiraz, factory workers abandoned production lines and marched downtown. Mashhad, seminary students joined street crowds instead of classes. Tabriz, Azeri language chants mixed with Persian calls for justice. Ahwaz, Arab Iranians in the south raised banners demanding an end to oil wealth disappearing into regime pockets. In smaller towns, Kerman, Zahedan, and Rasht, people simply stopped obeying. Taxi drivers turned off meters and drove protesters wherever they wanted to go. Shopkeepers lowered shutters to regime offices but kept doors open to neighbors. Despite the total internet blackout, information moved faster than ever. VPN tunnels, smuggled Starlink dishes hidden on rooftops, Bluetooth file-sharing networks. Videos circulated in minutes. A Basij fighter in Karaj removing his vest and handing his rifle butt first to a teenage girl. An IRGC colonel in Kermanshah recording a resignation speech on his phone and posting it before disappearing. Women in Qom pulling down enormous billboards of Khamenei while men formed a protective ring around them. The regime's iron spine was bending. Inside what remained of the power structure, fear metastasized. The Assembly of Experts, the 88 senior clerics constitutionally responsible for selecting a new supreme leader, scheduled an emergency meeting in Qom for March 3rd. Travel proved impossible for many. Convoys were stopped by human walls of protesters. Several members simply did not leave their homes. By midday, March 2nd, only 47 had reached the Holy City, well below the quorum needed to convene. Makbar issued an emergency decree extending his interim authority indefinitely, citing the national security crisis. Hardliners around the IRGC called him a coward in private WhatsApp groups. A few reformist-leaning clerics began to float the unthinkable, perhaps direct negotiations, with protest leaders, with the diaspora, even with Washington. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps fractured along fault lines no one had mapped before. In Tehran, some brigade commanders quietly ordered their units to remain in barracks rather than deploy against civilians. Others fortified government ministries, state television headquarters, even prison. In Isfahan, factions within the 14th Imam Hussein Division exchanged fire for 90 minutes on March 4th, loyalists versus defectors, before local tribal elders brokered a tense ceasefire. 12 bodies lay in the street when the shooting stopped. Conflicting reports swirled. Ghani, commander of the Quds Force, had been killed in the original strike. No, he was rallying loyalists near Mashhad. No, he had defected and was in hiding. The truth drowned in noise. Iran's regional allies froze. Hezbollah's statement from Beirut was brief and careful. Condolences, continued resistance, no mention of mobilization. The Houthis in Yemen launched one token missile into the Red Sea on March 5th, then went silent. Iraqi Shia militias issued angry press releases but kept their fighters home. The axis of resistance, built brick by brick over 40 years, suddenly looked like a house of cards without Tehran's money and orders. The world reacted in jagged pieces. March 2nd, UN Security Council emergency session. Russia and China branded the strikes as barbaric aggression and demanded immediate cessation of hostilities. The United States vetoed the draft resolution. France, Britain, Germany urged de-escalation and humanitarian corridors. Turkey offered itself as mediator. Saudi Arabia and the UAE issued no statements at all. They were watching, waiting, recalculating decades-old enmities. President Trump spoke from the White House Rose Garden on March 3rd. We removed the head of a regime that has sponsored terror and crushed its own people for too long. Now the future belongs to Iranians. If they choose freedom, America will stand with them. If they descend into chaos, that choice is theirs. He announced U.S.-facilitated humanitarian corridors through Iraq and Turkey for any Iranian wishing temporary refuge. He avoided the phrase regime change. He didn't have to say it. Israel maintained pressure. Between March 4th and March 10th, 4 additional waves of strikes targeted missile deposits, drone production facilities, and suspected chemical munition sites. Civilian casualties stayed low, deliberately so, but each explosion deepened the atmosphere of siege. Inside Iran, the streets became the real battlefield. March 7th saw the largest march since the revolution itself. An estimated 1.2 million people flowed from Valiasar Square toward the Parliament building. IRGC snipers were visible on rooftops. Basij reinforcements streamed in from outlying provinces. Everyone waited for the spark. It never came. At the intersection of Enqilab and Azadi, the front ranks halted. A line of women stepped forward, arms raised, white lilies in their hands. Behind them, young men dropped to their knees, palms open. The chant narrowed to one word, slow and deliberate: Azadi, Azadi, Azadi. Minutes stretched into an hour, then two. No megaphone command to fire arrived. Some Basij members lowered Kalashnikovs, others simply melted into side streets. By late afternoon, protesters entered the parliament courtyard unchallenged. They did not smash windows, they did not set fires. They sat in rows, they lit candles, they sang pre-revolutionary songs their grandparents had whispered. They waited. That night, the state television signal died for good. When it flickered back on March 8th, a stranger sat behind the anchor desk, an obscure mid-level cleric claiming to represent a hastily formed transitional council. Makbar's whereabouts became a national guessing game. Fled to Damascus, under house arrest by rogue IRGC units, dead in an internal purge, no one knew. By March 15th, Iran's political geography had redrawn itself in real time. Central government ministries in Tehran stood occupied by civilians, defected soldiers, and student organizers. Provincial governors in Iranian Kurdistan, Balochistan, and Khuzestan announced temporary autonomous administration to prevent collapse of basic services. Universities transformed into coordination centers, printing daily newsletters, running first aid stations, organizing food distribution networks. Pirate radio stations broadcast from moving vans. Telegram supergroups replaced ministries. A short-lived television channel beamed live from a Karaj rooftop for 48 hours before being jammed. Estimated deaths since February 28th hovered around 1,800, mostly from the initial strike, scattered clashes, and heart attacks among the elderly watching events unfold. Still far fewer than the January massacre, but every name carried weight. And in every city, every village, the same question hung in the air like smoke. Who speaks for Iran now? 15 days after the shadow fell, the theocracy no longer existed in anything but name. Iran had become a nation in search of itself, raw, fractured, dangerous, and for the first time in decades, possible.
When the head is severed, the body does not die instantly. It convulses, it searches for new direction. It tears itself in different directions at once. In the 14 days that followed the strike on February 28th, Iran did not collapse into one clean new order. Instead, power shattered into dozens of sharp fragments, each one claiming to be the legitimate voice of the nation. In Tehran itself, three broad currents emerged almost immediately, pulling the city in competing directions. The first current formed around the universities: Sharif, Tehran University, Amir Kabir, Alameh Tabatabai. Students, professors, young doctors, lawyers, and artists who had led the January protests now turned occupied buildings into coordination hubs. They called their loose network the People's Coordination Committees. Every afternoon they held open microphones in the old parliament courtyard. Anyone could speak for 3 minutes. Decisions came through hand raises or hurried phone polls over patchy networks. Their demands stayed clear and unchanging: immediate release of all political prisoners, complete separation of religion from state, a constituent assembly to write a new, secular constitution, free elections within 1 year. They adopted no single leader. Their only symbol was a hand-drawn white circle with a small red dot inside. One people, one shared future. The second current gathered around surviving figures from the old reformist wing and a handful of mid-level military officers who had defected in the first chaotic hours. They based themselves in the former Foreign Ministry building near Ferdowsi Square. They spoke of an orderly transition, a temporary National Salvation Council, preservation of the armed forces as a single institution, and gradual change rather than rupture. Their most visible spokesperson became a veteran activist released from Evin prison days after the strike, someone who had spent years in and out of solitary but still carried name recognition from the 2009 Green Movement.
They raised the old pre-revolutionary tricolor with the lion and sun emblem, insisting the flag had never belonged to the clerical regime. Many in the streets distrusted them on sight. Graffiti appeared overnight, same suits, new promises. The third current was the most dangerous and least visible. Remnants of the loyalist IRGC and Basij units. They held pockets around military bases in Karaj, Qazvin, parts of Isfahan province, and isolated compounds near Semnan. From hidden transmitters, they broadcast nightly declarations. The strike was a foreign coup. The acting leadership was illegitimate. Resistance would continue until the true chain of command was restored. Whenever they captured suspected collaborators, real or imagined, they staged public executions recorded on phones. The videos were meant to instill terror. Instead, each one swelled the crowds against them. Beyond the capital, the country splintered along older fault lines that had long been suppressed. In Kurdish regions, Mahabad, Sanandaj, Kermanshah, local committees took control of administration. Schools began teaching in Kurdish again. Armed local units patrolled roads and refused entry to any force claiming orders from Tehran. They flew their red sunburst flags alongside the lion and sun, but made no formal declaration of independence. Their message was simple: we defend our communities until a fair future is decided by all. In Sistan and Baluchistan, Zahedan and surrounding towns became self-governing zones under rotating councils of tribal elders, Sunni clerics, and youth activists who had survived years of crackdowns. They reopened border crossings with Pakistan for food, medicine, and fuel. IRGC convoys attempting to re-enter were turned back without major fighting. Local fighters simply blocked roads with civilian vehicles. Even in the religious heartland of Qum and Mashhad, clerical authority fractured. Younger seminary students openly questioned Wilayat Faqih for the first time in public. Older hardliners insisted the institution must endure. Neighborhood committees, ordinary people, began running water distribution, food banks, and security patrols because no one else could. Across the country, basic governance became patchwork. Some cities ran on barter and local coupons printed on home printers. Others accepted US dollars and Turkish lira that poured in through open borders. Electricity returned in rolling shifts wherever generators could be fueled. Hospitals operated on donated medicines smuggled through Turkey and Iraq. Heavy clashes erupted around Tehran's international airport as different factions tried to control runways and fuel depots. The airport changed hands twice in 1 week before local civilians formed a human chain to keep all armed groups out. A sniper fired at a prominent reformist figure during a street speech. The bullet missed but killed his driver. No group claimed it. Everyone accused someone else. Evin prison's guards abandoned posts en masse. Political prisoners walked free. So did many common criminals. Some joined protest committees. Others vanished into the city. By the end of the second week, no single group held undisputed control of Tehran, let alone the whole country. State television remained off-air. When pirate signals occasionally appeared, they carried conflicting messages from different factions. Internet remained mostly severed, but VPN tunnels, Bluetooth mesh networks, and smuggled satellite dishes kept information moving. Videos of street debates, lists of missing people, calls for blood donors, poetry readings under candlelight. In parks and squares every evening, people gathered, not always to march, but to talk, to read aloud from banned books, to sing old songs their parents had whispered, to argue about what should come next. One night in Vanak Square, a young woman in her early 20s stood on a bench holding a borrowed microphone. Her voice carried over the quiet crowd. We still don't know who will lead. Maybe no one should lead alone. But right now, for the first time, we are the ones asking the questions. That is already more than we ever had. 14 days after the strike, the theocracy no longer governed in any meaningful way. Iran had become a nation of overlapping experiments, raw, contradictory, fragile, and, for the first time in decades, self-determined. The question that had burned since the smoke first rose over Niavaran still hung in every conversation. Who gets to decide what Iran becomes?
Not every fracture leads to collapse. Some become the places where new strength is forged. In the chaotic weeks after February 28th, Iran passed through several narrow moments, any one of which could have tipped the country into open civil war, foreign invasion, or simple disintegration. Instead, in each case, something held. The first turning point came at Tehran's Mehrabad airport around day 5. IRGC loyalist units from Qazvin had rolled south with armored vehicles, intent on retaking the airport to open a corridor for reinforcements and supplies from the north. At the same time, defected Air Force personnel and student militias had barricaded the runways with civilian buses and fire trucks. Both sides arrived armed and angry. Commanders on the loyalist side gave orders to advance with live fire if necessary. Then the unexpected happened. Hundreds of ordinary residents, mothers pushing strollers, shopkeepers still wearing aprons, elderly men with canes, poured onto the tarmac from surrounding neighborhoods. They formed a human wall between the two forces. No weapons, no banners, just bodies standing shoulder to shoulder. A woman in her 60s stepped forward holding a framed photograph of her grandson who had been killed in the January protests. She held it up silently. Behind her, others raised photos, phones playing short video clips of lost loved ones, children's drawings. The loyalist commander hesitated. His troops lowered barrels. After 40 tense minutes, the armored column reversed and withdrew without a shot fired. The airport remained in civilian hands. Word of the standoff spread instantly through word-of-mouth networks. It became known simply as the Mother's Line. For many, it was the first proof that sheer human presence could still stop guns. The second critical moment unfolded in Isfahan around day 9. The city had become a patchwork of control zones, university districts held by student committees, bazaar areas run by merchant councils, military bases still flying the old regime flag. On the morning of that day, a hardline IRGC splinter group attempted to seize the main fuel depot to cut off supplies to civilian neighborhoods. Fighting broke out, small arms, RPGs, a few armored vehicles exchanging fire near the Zayende River bridges. Casualties noted quickly on both sides. Then, local factory workers, many of them the same people who had kept production lines running under sanctions for years, marched en masse to the bridges. They carried no guns, only tools, wrenches, hammers, welding torches. They positioned themselves along the riverbank and began dismantling the bridges themselves, cutting cables, removing supports, dropping sections into the water. Their message was unmistakable. If you want to fight over the city, you will do it without fuel, without movement, without escape. The loyalists pulled back rather than be trapped. The bridges were later rebuilt by the same workers, but the message lingered. Ordinary labor could become a weapon of denial stronger than bullets. The third turning point was quieter, but perhaps the most decisive. By the second week, food shortages began to bite in Tehran and several other major cities. Warehouses were emptying, trucks from the provinces were being stopped at checkpoints by competing factions demanding taxes or loyalty oaths. Hunger was starting to turn anger into desperation. Then, neighborhood self-organization networks, born during the January blackout, scaled up rapidly. Women who had coordinated kitchens during the protests now turned them into citywide distribution hubs. They mapped remaining stocks using hand-drawn charts passed door to door. They negotiated directly with farmers on the outskirts, bypassing all official channels. They set up collection points in mosques, schools, parks, neutral ground where no faction dared interfere for fear of being seen as starving their own people. Within days, bread, rice, lentils, and cooking oil were moving again, not perfectly, not equally, but enough to prevent mass panic. The distribution committees refused to favor any political group. They served whoever arrived with an empty bag. When one faction tried to seize a warehouse, the women simply locked the doors and sat in front, refusing to move until the armed men left. They did. These three moments, the Mother's Line at the airport, the workers' bridge defense in Isfahan, the women's food networks in Tehran, did not end the power struggle, but they changed its terms.
Armed groups began to realize that brute force alone could no longer hold territory if the population refused to cooperate. Factions that relied only on guns started losing legitimacy even among their own ranks. Defections accelerated, not dramatic mass mutinies, but quiet ones. A squad here, a platoon there, soldiers slipping away at night to return to their families or join civilian committees. At the same time, the absence of large-scale foreign intervention helped keep the temperature from boiling over. The United States maintained its public line, humanitarian corridors open, support for any Iranian-led democratic process, no boots on the ground. Israel continued targeted strikes on remaining missile and drone sites, but avoided anything that could be framed as occupation. Russia and China issued condemnations but sent no meaningful aid to loyalist remnants. Saudi Arabia and the UAE watched closely, offering quiet back-channel contacts to every side, but committing to none. Inside the country, the conversation slowly shifted from who will rule to how will we live together. In parks and university courtyards, people began holding structured debates, sometimes lasting hours, about basic questions. Should religion have any role in law? Should the military remain centralized or regionalized? Should oil revenue be distributed by province or nationally? Should borders be opened fully or controlled? No one had final answers, but the fact that the questions were being asked openly without immediate fear of arrest felt revolutionary in itself. One evening, in a small square near Vinok, a mixed group, students, former soldiers, housewives, shopkeepers, sat in a circle under string lights powered by a car battery. An older man, perhaps in his 70s, spoke first. "I lived through 1979. I believed then. I believed again in 2009. I believed in January. Now I am tired of believing in saviors. I just want my grandchildren to grow up without being afraid to speak." A young woman across from him nodded. "Then let's stop waiting for someone to save us. Let's save ourselves, one conversation at a time." The country had not healed, far from it. Deep wounds remained: grief, distrust, hunger, fear of what might come next. But in those narrow turning points, Iran had avoided the worst paths: total warlordism, foreign occupation, complete collapse into famine and chaos. It had chosen, imperfectly, messily, the harder road, staying in conversation with itself. For the first time in decades, the future was not something imposed from above. It was something being built, word by word, choice by choice, in the streets below.
Survival is not the same as rebirth. It is only the beginning of the hardest work. In the weeks that followed the turning points, the mother's line at the airport, the workers' defense of the bridges in Isfahan, the women's food networks that kept hunger at bay, Iran did not suddenly become one nation again. What began to emerge instead was something rarer and more fragile: the first tentative outlines of a shared conversation about what the country could become. The most visible shift happened in Tehran's old Azadi Square. Once the site of regime-orchestrated rallies and violent crackdowns, it transformed into an open-air forum that never closed. Every day at sunrise, people arrived with folding chairs, blankets, megaphones borrowed from music shops, whiteboards scavenged from schools. They divided the square into rough zones: one corner for discussing security and defense, another for food and water distribution, a third for constitutional questions, a fourth simply for anyone who needed to speak without an agenda. No one led these gatherings in the old sense. A rotating group of facilitators, often young women who had organized during the January protests, kept time and ensured no single voice dominated. Anyone could take the floor for 5 minutes. When debates grew heated, facilitators would call for a silent minute. Everyone sat quietly, breathing together, until the anger cooled enough to continue. The questions they wrestled with were enormous and painful. Should there be a military at all, or only regional defense forces accountable to local councils? Should religious institutions receive state funding, or be entirely separate and self-financed?
How should oil and gas revenue be divided? By population, by province, or through a national fund open to public audit? What justice for the past? Truth commissions, trials for former regime officials, or amnesty to prevent endless revenge cycles? No votes were binding yet. These were not decisions. They were the slow mapping of what people could even imagine agreeing on. Similar forums sprang up in other cities, each shaped by its own history and wounds. In Tabriz, discussions focused heavily on linguistic and cultural rights, Azeri, Kurdish, Balochi speakers insisting their languages be official in education and courts. In Zahedan, the emphasis was on ending decades of discrimination against Sunni communities and ensuring border trade remained open. In Ahwaz, oil workers demanded not just revenue sharing, but environmental cleanup of polluted lands and rivers. Despite the differences, common threads appeared across the country. Almost universal rejection of any return to Wilayat-e-Faqih or a single supreme religious authority. Widespread insistence that no armed group, whether former IRGC, student militias, or tribal forces, should hold monopoly power. Growing agreement that a national referendum or constituent assembly must happen soon, even if no one yet knew exactly how to organize it safely. The loyalist remnants did not disappear quietly. In pockets around Karaj and Qam, small units continued hit-and-run attacks on food convoys and civilian gatherings. Each incident killed a handful, deepened grief, and tested the fragile restraint of the emerging civilian networks. But the response was telling. Instead of revenge raids, local committees organized public funerals that brought thousands together in mourning, then turned those gatherings into renewed calls for dialogue. The cycle of violence, so familiar from the past, did not fully reignite. International actors began to adjust to the new reality. The United States expanded its humanitarian corridors through Iraq and Turkey, flying in medical supplies, water purification kits, and portable solar generators. Officials repeated the same careful line: "This is an Iranian process. America will support whatever path the Iranian people choose, as long as it is peaceful and inclusive." No one believed the words were entirely selfless. Everyone understood Washington hoped for a non-hostile neighbor, but the restraint helped prevent the narrative of foreign puppet from taking root. As for Israel, they scaled back airstrikes to only the most immediate threats, remaining long-range missile sites and drone factories. After one particularly precise operation that destroyed a cache without civilian casualties, an anonymous statement circulated in Persian on smuggled networks. "We struck the regime, not the people. We will stop when the threat stops." It was not trust-building, but it was a signal that escalation was not inevitable. Russia and China remained distant, condemning the original strike, offering vague reconstruction loans, and quietly evacuating a few former officials. Neither moved to arm loyalists or intervene directly. The absence of great power proxies helped keep the internal struggle from becoming another regional battlefield. Inside Iran, the most powerful force remained ordinary people refusing to let the country fracture completely. Neighborhood committees that had started as survival networks began linking up regionally. Food, medicine, fuel, and information moved along human chains, farmers handing produce to truck drivers, drivers to local councils, councils to city distribution points. Money flowed the same way, small donations collected at gatherings, wired through informal hawala networks to buy essentials abroad. One afternoon in Shiraz, a group of teachers, engineers, nurses, and former soldiers sat under the shade of orange trees in Iram Garden. They had been meeting daily for a week, drafting what they called a preliminary charter of common principles. When they finished reading the draft aloud, the small crowd that had gathered listened in silence. Then a retired mechanic stood up. "I don't understand half the words, but I understand this. No one gets to tell my daughter what she can wear, where she can study, or who she can love. If that's in your charter, I'll sign it with my blood." The group did not cheer. They simply nodded, added his words verbatim to the document, and kept working. By the end of this period, something intangible had shifted. The question was no longer only who will rule. It had become, how will we rule ourselves together? No one pretended the path ahead would be smooth. Deep mistrust remained, economic pain deepened daily, armed groups still lurked in shadows, and grief for the dead, both from the strike and from decades before, hung over every conversation. Yet in those quiet gatherings, in the patient rewriting of shared rules, and in the refusal to let violence have the final word, Iran was doing something it had not done in living memory. It was trying to imagine a future that belonged to everyone. The dawn was fragile. It could still shatter. But for the first time, enough people were willing to stand in the light and hold the pieces together. The country had not yet been reborn, but it had begun, painfully and deliberately, to give birth to itself.
Revolutions do not end with a single day, a single strike, or a single square filled with candles. They end, if they ever truly end, with ordinary mornings that feel almost normal and the quiet realization that the work has only just begun. Weeks have passed since the missiles fell on February 28th. The supreme leader and his inner circle are gone. The old regime's symbols have been pulled down, burned, or quietly painted over. State television has not returned to regular programming. Instead, pirate signals and rooftop broadcasts carry voices from every corner of the country. The internet flickers in and out, but people have learned to live without it. Bluetooth chains, word of mouth, handwritten newsletters passed door to door. Food arrives irregularly. Electricity still fails at night, but the panic of those first days has eased into something harder and more enduring: determination. What has been gained cannot be measured in headlines or maps redrawn. It lives in small, stubborn facts. No faction has managed to impose martial law or a new supreme authority. Neighborhood committees that started distributing bread now run schools, clinics, water points. Women walk unveiled in every major city, not as an act of defiance anymore, but as something ordinary. Kurdish, Balochi, Arab, Azeri voices speak openly in forums about rights, language, autonomy, and Persian speakers listen without immediate accusations of separatism. Former IRGC soldiers who laid down weapons have been accepted into civilian defense patrols, watched closely but not hunted. These are not victories written in stone. They are fragile agreements, renewed every day through conversation, compromise, and the simple refusal to let fear win again. The question of leadership remains unanswered in the old sense. No single figure has risen to claim the title of president, prime minister, or supreme guide. Instead, rotating councils have formed at city and provincial levels, some elected informally in public squares, others appointed by consensus among surviving institutions like universities, bazaar guilds, tribal elders. They issue no grand decrees. They coordinate essentials: fuel allocation, medical supply routes, repair of power lines. When disputes arise, they call for open assemblies rather than force. It is messy, slow, sometimes infuriating, but it is Iranian-led, Iranian-decided. Justice for the past has taken a painful, uneven path. In some neighborhoods, former Basij members have quietly apologized to families they harmed and been forgiven in small, private ceremonies. In others, people have demanded trials.
Mobile truth commissions, groups of lawyers, psychologists, clergy, ordinary citizens, travel between cities, collecting testimony. No one pretends the process is complete or fair. Some perpetrators have fled across borders, others remain hidden. But the mere act of listening without immediate retribution has begun to drain the poison of decades of silence. The economy is a wound that will take years to heal. Sanctions still bite. Oil exports crawl at a fraction of former levels. Yet local barter networks have grown into regional trade webs. Farmers bring produce directly to city squares. Artisans reopen workshops. Young coders using salvaged equipment have built simple apps for tracking food stocks and medical needs. International humanitarian aid flows in through Turkey and Iraq. Not enough, never enough, but enough to keep hospitals open and children fed. The outside world watches with cautious distance. Washington keeps repeating variations of the same sentence: Iran belongs to Iranians. No embassy has reopened yet. An interests section operates out of Ankara. Israel has ceased major strikes, though drones still patrol borders. Saudi Arabia and UAE have sent quiet delegations to speak with council representatives, not to dictate terms, but to explore what a non-hostile neighbor might look like. Russia and China issue statements about sovereignty, but offer little concrete help. For once, the region has not been flooded with weapons or mercenaries. That absence is, in its own way, a gift. And yet, nothing is settled. Loyalist cells still launch occasional attacks. Hunger still stalks poorer neighborhoods. Old grudges simmer beneath new alliances. Some whisper that the revolution has already been betrayed by compromise. Others fear that without compromise, it will devour itself. Every night, in homes across the country, families ask the same questions over tea. Will this last? Can we hold it together? What happens when winter comes? One evening in a small courtyard in Karaj, a mixed group gathers around a single lantern. An elderly woman who lost her son in the 2022 protests speaks first. "I used to pray for the regime to fall so my grandchildren could live free. Now I pray they live long enough to see what free actually means." A young man who fought at the airport standoff answers quietly. "We don't know yet, but we're still here. We're still talking. That's more than they ever let us do." The circle falls silent for a long moment, then someone begins to sing, an old pre-revolutionary ballad about spring returning after a hard winter. The voices join, hesitant at first, then stronger, not in celebration, not in mourning, just in persistence. This is not the end of the story. There is no triumphant music cue, no flag raised over a new palace, no single leader waving from a balcony. There is only a people who, after 47 years of being spoken for, have begun, painfully, imperfectly, courageously, to speak for themselves. They have lost too much. They have gained something fragile and unprecedented, the chance to decide, together, what comes next. Whether they can hold that chance, whether it will grow into something lasting or fracture again under pressure, no one can say with certainty. But on this day, in this moment, Iran is no longer a fortress of one voice. It is a conversation, raw, unfinished, alive. And that conversation, after so long, is finally in the hands of the people who must live its answers.
Imagine waking up tomorrow morning in a country where no one has to imagine freedom anymore. Not because every problem has been solved, not because justice has been perfectly served, not because the scars have vanished or the graves have stopped being dug, but because for the first time in a lifetime, the question is no longer who will allow us to live. It is how will we choose to live together. This is what the people of Iran have begun to claim in the weeks since the shadow fell. They have buried their dead. They have mourned the disappeared.
They have fed strangers when there was barely enough for themselves. They have sat in circles under lantern light and argued, cried, laughed, and listened until dawn broke again. They have not built a perfect republic. What they have built is far more rare, a space where it is possible to try. The road ahead will be long. Winter will come, and with it, hunger, cold, doubt. Old wounds will reopen, new ones will form. There will be days when hope feels like a luxury no one can afford. Yet something has shifted irrevocably. A generation that grew up whispering now speaks in full voice. Women who were told where to stand now walk wherever they choose. Children who learned fear as a second language are learning curiosity instead. No one knows whether this fragile dawn will last. History is full of mornings that promised everything and delivered nothing. It is also full of mornings that seemed ordinary at the time and quietly changed everything. What matters is not the certainty of the outcome. What matters is that the people are still here, still talking, still refusing to let the conversation end. For them, for the mothers who stood in human lines, the workers who dismantled bridges rather than let violence cross, the young women who pinned names to community boards, the old men who watered flowers in cracked pots, this is no longer just a revolution. It is home. In the end, revolutions are not won by missiles or martyrs alone. They are carried forward by the quiet choice to keep showing up, to keep asking questions, to keep holding space for one another when everything else falls away. The story of Iran is not finished. It never will be. But right now, in this moment, it is being written by the people who must live every line. And that, after so much silence, is already a kind of victory. For the people of Iran, and for everyone, everywhere, still waiting for their dawn. The end.